On May 2nd, 2011, a caring grandfather who enjoyed poetry and loved to walk among his apple trees was shot and killed by the intruders who broke into his home. His name was Osama bin Laden, and he was the mastermind behind the most devastating terrorist attack that shook the entire world. Nearly 3,000 people were burned alive or forced to jump to their deaths when hijacked airliners crashed into the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. This was only one of the many attacks that bin Laden took credit for, and so it was no surprise that when he was killed, his death was celebrated across the entire globe. But his death was taken as a loss by millions of others, and there are some, including the neighbours of his secret compound in Pakistan, who believe to this day that he was never killed at all.
People here say the Americans haven't proven anything. They haven't shown bin Laden's dead body.
So how does a man responsible for the mass murder of thousands become so admired? And why would the son of a billionaire business tycoon choose a life like this one, which forced him to give up so much of his wealth and freedom, as he spent over a decade in hiding with his family? This is the story of a deadly clash between deep faith and a powerful ego, between one man's heart for his people and his urge to take revenge for what he believed the West had done. This is the story of Osama bin Laden. It all started in Eastern Arabia in 1931, when bin Laden's poor immigrant father decided to start a construction company. It was a stroke of unbelievable luck, as not even 1 year later, Eastern and Southern Arabia were merged into one, as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The new king had a vision for his country, and that meant he needed to build. Bin Laden's father won a contract that impressed the king so much that his company became enormously successful. Within the coming decades, his family would become known as the wealthiest non-royal family in the entire kingdom. Knowing this, you might expect that Osama bin Laden would have grown up like a prince. And to be sure, that was the childhood that some of his siblings had. But it wasn't so easy for him. Bin Laden's father took 22 wives and fathered 52 children. In 1957, after decades of building his empire, Osama was born, the only child of his by the daughter of a Syrian citrus farmer, who others in the family would refer to as the slave wife. Bin Laden's father spent so little time with her that some said she wasn't his wife at all, and after only a few years, he separated from her. Bin Laden's mother remarried and had 4 other children, and that is the household he grew up in, separated from the vast majority of his other siblings and their ultra-luxurious childhoods. However, bin Laden's father, who was both strict and devout, was still involved in his upbringing. Unlike most wealthy Saudi Arabian children who went off to the best private academies the world had to offer, bin Laden's father insisted that he study at a much more conservative religious school. A school that instructed its students in deep faith, a love for one's people, and in the righteousness of jihad.
You have declared a jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
Bin Laden had spent his youth apart from most of his family. He'd watched his siblings experience luxuries that were never available to him. Despite his love for his father, it was impossible not to feel like he was an outcast. And then, when bin Laden was only 10, his father died in a terrible plane crash when his pilot misjudged the landing. Bin Laden's school offered a comfort that was undeniable, and he immersed himself in his studies. He learned the Holy Quran in detail, and he also grew up hearing about the struggles happening in the Muslim world, especially tension building in places like Afghanistan, where foreign powers were influencing local governments and Muslims were suffering. He kept seeing reports of Western powers getting involved in Muslim lands, supporting governments he believed were harming their own people, and this slowly shaped how he viewed the world. As bin Laden grew, his father's company flourished under his brothers. They saw that he was a keen student and encouraged him to continue his studies in Oxford, where he could learn the intricacies of business. Even though studying in the West seemed to run contrary to what he learned in school and what his father had wished for him, this was a chance to be involved in his family in a way he'd never been before. He also stood to inherit at least $30 million. And so bin Laden went to England, and for a short time he embraced it, even becoming a supporter of Arsenal Football Club. But he couldn't shake the things he'd learned from the Quran and from his teachers. And so when he had a chance to return and help the business at only 19, he took it. However, that wouldn't last for long. Turmoil in the Middle East was only increasing, as powers throughout the world saw the region as a key to economic success. When bin Laden was barely 21, he was shocked by the news that Afghanistan had been invaded and occupied by the Soviet Union. He saw Muslims dying in their own land, and as a devout Muslim, he felt it was his duty to stand up for his brothers. It was a violation that felt deeply personal, and despite his chance to be part of the family business, he couldn't turn away. He believed he had to answer what was being done by foreign powers, so he left everything and travelled to Pakistan. Soon after arriving, bin Laden met Abdullah Azzam, a jihadist leader who had influenced many of the most well-known fighters of that time. Azzam immediately saw the leadership potential in bin Laden. Not just because of his wealth, but also because his deep passion for Islam and his people. He took bin Laden under his wing and encouraged him not only to join the fight, but to help recruit others to fight with him. That's exactly what bin Laden did. He started using his fortune and his connections to recruit Saudi Arabian fighters for the cause. In a surprising twist, the US and other Western powers were aligned with him, since the Soviets were a common enemy. They equipped the Afghan fighters with weapons and training, and bin Laden himself was in touch with US Special Forces, who many speculate helped to train him directly. The war in Afghanistan was long and brutal, with millions of people killed. Many likened it to the United States invasion of Vietnam, as the Soviets fought an enemy that they couldn't defeat. People who were fighting for their homes and their way of life.
We don't think about losing or winning the war. And if we are killed, we are killed in the way of God Almighty.
Bin Laden became a major figure in the war, supplying goods and weapons to the fighters, raising enormous amounts of funds, many from Western sources, and training fighters in the compound he'd built, which became known as Al-Masada, the Lion's Den. He became a folk hero in the Muslim world. As many saw him defending Muslims against foreign powers they believed were invading their lands and causing suffering. And as his reach became more powerful, he decided he needed a larger organization with the sole purpose of removing all non-Muslim powers that were causing devastation in the Muslim world. In 1988, at the age of 31, bin Laden named his new group the Foundation, or Al-Qaeda. Their goal was to wage jihad on non-Muslim forces in the Muslim world. Expelling the Soviets, removing the US from the Middle East, and destroying the State of Israel were among their top priorities, as was establishing Sharia law. Just 1 year after their formation, the Soviet troops withdrew from Afghanistan. It was a huge victory, and it gave them a chance to use that energy in a new direction. By now, one of the most famous and admired people in the Muslim world, bin Laden believed that if he could defeat one superpower, he could also defeat the United States and push them out. He also thought this would make more Muslims follow his ideas and grow his supporters and army. Bin Laden began to meet with other Muslim leaders. His intent was clear. He desired an aggressive path to expelling all non-Muslim powers that were influencing Muslim culture, spreading devastation in Muslim lands, and harming Muslim people. Much to his dismay, this soon became a problem for the Saudi government, who wasn't so ready to anger some of its biggest economic partners. But things were about to get much worse. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, the international anger pushed the USA to prepare a counter-invasion of Iraq. They used nearby Saudi Arabia as their base, and when negotiations failed, they quickly launched their invasion, Operation Desert Storm. Bin Laden was furious. He couldn't believe the Saudis would allow America to use their land to invade a Muslim nation. But the Saudis were also concerned about Hussein, and the Americans had offered to use their military to defend their border. Bin Laden met with the king and offered Al-Qaeda for defense instead. The king refused. And when Bin Laden became more aggressive in his demands, the Saudis banished him from the country. Bin Laden was humiliated and outraged. He set up a new compound in Sudan where Sharia law was already in place, and he plotted his revenge against America. And within just a few short months, his followers would carry out its first attacks. On a quiet December evening in 1992, explosions went off at 2 hotels in Yemen, where US troops were staying. 2 innocents were killed and 4 were injured. And although none of them were American, the targets were clear. Bin Laden took credit for the bombings, and they would be the first of many. As Middle Eastern governments vowed to crack down on the terrorists and many in the Muslim world stood against them, thousands of others became radicalized, just as Bin Laden predicted. To many Muslims, these attacks were completely wrong because they killed innocent people, which is completely against the core teachings of Islam. But at the same time, some radical groups began to believe that the United States had already done the same things in the Middle East, and so they saw fighting back in this way as the only answer. Muslims turned on each other, civil war erupted in Afghanistan, and after years of fighting, the Taliban and Sharia law emerged victorious. Sudan, who had continued to shelter Bin Laden, became the subject of brutal US sanctions.
The United States has imposed sweeping new economic sanctions against the government of Sudan because of its continued sponsorship of international terror.
Unable to withstand him any longer, they expelled Bin Laden in 1996, forcing him to leave his enormous compound and much of his wealth behind. Angrier than ever, Bin Laden officially declared war on the USA, believing this was his chance to take revenge for what he thought America had done in the Muslim world. He chose to fight this war through terrorism. Bin Laden fled with his family and followers into the mountains of Afghanistan, and on a frigid February day in 1998, he issued a religious ruling called a fatwa, which declared the United States as an enemy of Islam, and called for the killing of Americans everywhere, civilians and soldiers alike. But as soon as this fatwa was released, many Muslim scholars issued counter-fatwas, saying that killing innocent civilians is completely forbidden in Islam and goes against the core teachings of jihad, which has strict laws not to harm non-combatants. Most Muslim scholars and a large part of the Muslim world rejected his ruling and called it absolutely wrong, saying that Islam only allows fighting against soldiers in a real battle, not innocent people. On the other hand, this fatwa was mostly ignored by the West, until one morning a few months later, when 2 truck bombs exploded simultaneously in East Africa, over 800 kilometers away from each other. Their targets were the US embassies in the capital cities of Kenya and Tanzania. The carnage was catastrophic. Hundreds were killed and thousands were injured, many of them American. And overnight, Bin Laden found himself on the FBI's list of the top 10 most wanted in the world. But he wasn't done there. 2 years later, a small fiberglass boat carrying C4 rammed into the US Navy destroyer the USS Cole, ripping its hull apart with a blast that killed 17 people. But these attacks were just a shadow of what was to come. Bin Laden had set his sights on the World Trade Center's Twin Towers by 1999. He knew that a successful attack there would bring attention to Al-Qaeda and strike fear into Western hearts like nothing else could. A truck bombing in 1993 had been largely unsuccessful, and although Bin Laden never took credit for it, he knew he had to do better. He focused his efforts on the air. He installed terrorist cells in the states of Florida, California, and Arizona, seeking men who would speak English and who understood Western customs. and just as importantly, men who were commercial pilots. In the end, he found 19 of them who were willing to sacrifice their lives to his increasingly psychotic cause. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, a date that now lives in infamy throughout the world, 4 commercial airliners took off from US airports within minutes of each other. 2 of the ill-fated passengers on board, each of them was a typical long-distance flight, until the terrorists hijacked the planes and took over.
Nobody move. Everything will be okay. If you try to make any move, you'll danger yourself and the airplane. Just stay quiet.
2 of them headed for New York City, 2 for Washington, D.C. The plan was to crash the fuel-loaded jets into the Twin Towers, the Pentagon, and the US Capitol. And unfortunately, only the US Capitol was spared.
Can you see a guy at about 4,000 feet, about 5 east of the airport right now? Looks like he's...
Yeah, I see him.
You see a guy, look, is he descending through the building also?
He's descending really quick too, yeah.
Well, that's
2,500 feet now. He just dropped 800 feet in like one sweep.
That's another situation. What kind of airplane is that? Can you guys tell?
I don't know. I'll read it out in a minute. Another one just hit the building.
Wow. Another one just hit it hard. Another one just hit the roof fade.
The whole building just came apart.
Holy smokes.
Nearly 3,000 Americans were killed in the attacks, making it the deadliest terrorist attack in history. It had a crushing psychological impact in not just the USA, but across the entire globe. If the American superpower could be attacked in this way, what did it mean for everybody else? Within 1 week, the US Congress passed a resolution authorizing the use of force against those responsible for the attacks. The Taliban in Afghanistan had sheltered bin Laden, and when the United States demanded that he be handed over, the Taliban offered to discuss sending him to a neutral Islamic country for trial, but only if the United States stopped bombing and provided proof of his involvement. Because these terms were rejected, the Taliban were treated as an official target, and in less than a month after the Twin Towers were hit, attacks against them began. They seemed to be successful. By early December, the US had defeated the Taliban and helped install a new government in Afghanistan. But it was a false victory. American troops were attacked by insurgent revolts, which developed into a war that they would never be able to win. And worse still, they were unable to find bin Laden, who had managed to flee into Pakistan. A $25 million reward was placed on bin Laden's head, making him the most wanted man in the world, and greatly reducing the number of people he could trust. He became an expert at staying hidden, continuing to work with his top leaders through handwritten messages and spycraft. And as he had a new compound built for him and his family in Pakistan, attacks on US forces and allies throughout the Muslim world continued with a fury. Bin Laden's new home was in a walled-off estate in a remote, unassuming region of Pakistan. Unlike before, when he lived in vast compounds with many of his leaders and followers, bin Laden had reduced his company to 3 of his 4 wives, most of his children, and 2 trusted bodyguards. For bin Laden and his family, the estate became their entire world. They grew vegetables, raised chickens, and planted apple trees. The walls were high enough to keep out prying eyes, and when bin Laden chose to leave the 3-story home for walks through his orchard, he wore a large hat to frustrate the satellites overhead. But as good as he became at hiding, bin Laden never grew used to it, even after a decade. He certainly tried. His many children and grandchildren became the center of his life. He would read them poetry, teach them the Quran, and show the boys how to shoot a BB gun. But all the while, he could feel himself losing control over Al-Qaeda. Visitors were not allowed, not even his highest officers. He had to pass them messages through his bodyguards as they visited town to buy groceries. As the years passed, he couldn't help but notice how much less he would appear on the news. His public image, whether as a folk hero or a terrorist, was quickly beginning to fade. Thanks to his attacks, the US was more involved in the Middle East than they'd ever been before. the exact opposite of what he'd been trying to achieve, and he could barely even take part in the fight. And then in 2011, a series of protests and uprisings that became known as the Arab Spring took place. Bin Laden was proud to see his people revolting, but concerned by how peaceful it was. The 10-year anniversary of 9/11 was months away. It was the perfect time to make a statement. Bin Laden could no longer stay silent or outside the spotlight. More and more messages were sent to his leaders. That April, he recorded 12 minutes of audio praising the revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia. That was seemingly all it took. He'd underestimated how much the US still wanted him, and only a few days after that recording, in the early morning hours of May 2nd, 2011, 2 Black Hawk helicopters touched down outside his hideout. A few minutes and a brief firefight later, Osama bin Laden was dead. His body was found with cash and mobile phones sewn into his robes, as if he was ready to flee at a moment's notice. The soldiers who killed him took his body out to sea and wrapped it in chains, sinking it at an undisclosed location so his grave would never become a shrine for fundamentalists. To some, especially in regions like Afghanistan, Bin Laden is still seen as the folk hero who gave up a life of luxury to drive out the Soviets and unite the Muslim people against the intruder forces that were causing devastation in Muslim lands. Many other Muslims believe that what he did was great because they saw it as revenge for what the United States had done in the Middle East, but at the same time, they admit that the path he chose was completely wrong. Killing innocent non-combatant people goes against Islamic teachings and the laws of jihad, and cannot be justified no matter what. Others, like his neighbours in Pakistan, suspect that he still survives today and never even lived in the secret hideout with his family. To most, however, his name still sends a chill down their spine as it brings to mind his horrific attacks and the senseless wars that followed, acts that changed our world forever.